The storm began suddenly. Thoughts, like torn clouds, raced, collided, tore apart, and everything inside his head vibrated like live wires. He walked, not along the road, not along the street, along himself, through himself, step by step through the roar of judgments, the chill of doubts, and the hurricane of worries that swirled in his skull like dust in a closed room without windows. The voice inside wouldn't stop. It sounded like a commander, a hysteric, a prophet, all at once. It said, "You have to, you can't, look what you've done. Be strong, be better, be someone at last." And with each word, my heart clenched like a fist beating against my ribcage. But the man kept walking. He didn't argue. He didn't agree. He just looked. For the first time, not through his thoughts, but at them. He stopped being a participant in the internal drama. He became a spectator. And then the storm didn't disappear. No, it was still raging, but no longer inside, but somewhere in front of him, between him and the one he considered himself. Like a film, like a screen on which fears, expectations, grievances were projected. He saw that the voice was not him, that the panic was not him, that even the thought, "I think," was just another thought. And in that void, between the voice and the observation, for the first time in a long time, it became truly quiet. Not the kind of silence that sounds in a room without sound, but deep, ancient, as if it had always existed. Before words, before thoughts, before a name, he stood there, and the voice was still screaming, "You don't understand anything. You're running away. You're just hiding." But now it was as far away as the barking of a dog outside a closed window. And then he smiled. Not because he won, because I understood. The voice screams, but the silence behind it, that's who he is. He didn't try to hold on to this silence. He didn't make it a goal. He just let it be, like the sky, which is always there, even when everything is covered with clouds. He sat down. For no reason. Simply because there was nowhere else to go. Everything that had seemed necessary before, to run, to search, to explain, suddenly lost its flavor. Thoughts continued their movement, but they became like leaves floating on the surface of water. No need to catch them, no need to drown in them. They just are, and that's okay. The past no longer gnawed, the future no longer pulled. There was only this moment. In it, breath, the weight of the body, the warmth of the sun on the cheek, the sound of the wind knocking on the branches. Everything is simple, everything is clear, everything is wordless. And suddenly he saw how many years he had lived without looking. He looked at the world through the filter of an internal narrator who explained, judged, compared. This is good, this is bad. This person is dangerous. This one is needed. You must be like this. The voice was smart, loud, confidently sounded inside. And for so long he believed that this voice was himself. And now the voice was just a voice. Noise. And he is the one who hears, the one who sees, the one who watches. He stood up, but no longer to move forward, but to be. The world was the same: houses, trees, people, things to do. But he was no longer a prisoner. He knew he could listen to a voice, but not follow. Look at a thought, but not believe. Feel an emotion, and not disappear in it. Freedom came not as a victory, but as recognition. He is not a name, not a story, not wounds, not aspirations. He is the space in which all this arises and disappears. And in this space, amidst the noise and wind, he felt a presence, not his own, but as if the world itself was looking at itself through his eyes. Without words, without effort, just is. He walked differently now, not as before, not as someone who was looking for an answer, but as someone who had already heard the silence behind the question. Every movement, every moment became filled with a strange simplicity. He did not know where the road led, but this no longer worried him. There were still people around him. They were talking, hurrying, arguing, complaining. Their thoughts were still making noise, like a street full of horns, voices, screams. But now he wasn't lost in the noise. He heard it. It was outside of him. Sometimes the voice would come back. It would become thinner, more cunning. It would say, "Well, there you go again. You don't feel anything. You're detached. You're cold. That's also a mistake." But now he knew that even that was just another trick, another mask, because the voice would always be there, but it was no longer the master. He learned to listen, not to the sound, but to the pause between sounds. To look, not at the form, but at where the look comes from. He began to notice, behind every fear, silence. Behind every desire, peace. Even behind pain, the space into which it dissolves. And one morning he stood by the water. The lake was smooth as a mirror. The branches touched the surface, and it seemed as if the whole world was reflected in this quiet splash. And he suddenly realized this whole path was not a path to himself, but a path away from himself, from who he thought he was. There was no need to be someone now, no need to hold on to a role, an image, a personality. He could just be, without explanation, without a name. Passers-by might not notice anything special about him, and that was fine, because in his eyes there was no longer a need to prove his existence. He knew he was the presence in which everything happens, and when the voice whispered again, "You will disappear. You are nothing," he answered, not with words but with silence. The same silence that had been with him from the very beginning. Not empty, but alive. Not silent, but deep. And in it, finally, there was no need to be someone in order to be. He began to notice how strangely the world worked. People ran, clung, argued, searched. They searched for meaning, love, salvation. They searched for themselves, in others in recognition, in achievements. And every time he heard this, he recognized in their words the same voice that once screamed inside him. The voice that was convinced something is wrong, something is missing, you must become different. But now he knew the voice is not an enemy. It is simply afraid of disappearing, afraid of being left without a stage, without an audience, without history. It lives only when you believe it, when you are with it. He began to look at people differently, not through judgment, not through division, but through recognition. He saw how every person he encountered carried within themselves the same storm, the same longing for silence. They just hadn't stopped yet. They hadn't heard yet. They still believed that they were this noise. And so he didn't judge. He didn't try to explain. He simply was. His silence sometimes frightened others. It was like a mirror they didn't want to look into. But sometimes it became an anchor, a presence that demanded nothing. And then, for a few moments, others around him became quieter, calmer, more honest. One day a boy came up to him and asked, "Who are you?" He smiled and replied, "I don't know. And you?" The boy thought, frowned, then laughed. I guess it's just me." "It's a good start," he said. And he realized it no longer needs to be someone great, enlightened, special. Peace does not require significance. It simply is. And when you stop fighting to be someone, you finally allow the world to be as it is. He did not become a saint. He did not become a guru. He still ate, slept, made mistakes, was sad. But all this happened in silence, the kind that does not depend on circumstances, the kind that is like the sky, always behind the clouds. And every time the voice rose again, anxious, accusing, impatient, he remembered, "You are not the voice, you are the silence behind it." And he walked on, not somewhere, but simply to be. Time ceased to be a run. It became a breath, a simple pulse of being. He no longer lived in expectation, no longer waiting for love, for insight, for the end of the road. Everything that had seemed like the future had dissolved into the endless present, into this soft, living silence. And with that silence came a strange realization. Everything he had ever sought was already with him, not outside, but inside. not even inside, but before inside and outside, beyond all opposites, before words. He began to listen, not to answer, to look, not to understand, to feel, not to control. He was simply present, like the sky above the field, like the ocean beneath the waves, like a witness to life who was no longer afraid of what was happening. And then life began to unfold, not as a to-do list, but as a dance, not as a path to a goal, but as a constant discovery. Even pain was no longer an enemy. It came, and he met it. He did not turn away, did not shrink, did not run. And in this direct gaze into suffering, the pain lost its power, lost its edge, lost its identity. He saw that suffering was not something that happened to him. It was how he resisted, that the voice in his head was fed by struggle, and silence was just there, without effort, without conditions. One night he woke up. It was raining. Drops were softly hitting the glass. The room was dark, and yet there was no fear. He lay there, not thinking, not analyzing, just listening, not to the rain, but to what the rain was listening to. And in this night silence, among the sounds, he suddenly felt there is no he, no center, no I, separated from the world. There is only perception, only being, only pure, unmarked presence, in which everything appears and goes. And in this bottomless silence, there was no emptiness. There was love, but not the kind that demands, not the kind that holds, but the kind that simply knows. Love without an object, without a reason, like light, not because it is needed, but because it is there. He did not try to preserve this state, because he knew that the one who wants to preserve it is the noise himself. He simply lived, and every time the voice returned, with new fears, doubts, haste, he remembered, you are not a voice, you are the silence behind him, and she's not going anywhere. And then he became himself again, the one who has no name, no form, but there is an infinite, calm presence. In the morning, he went out into the street. The city lived its own bustle. Cars roared, people hurried, someone spoke into the phone, someone shouted something important to someone, as if life itself depended on words. Everything was as usual, but he saw it differently. He did not separate himself from this noise. He did not oppose his silence to the city hum. He was in it, and at the same time outside, like the air that is both inside the lungs and around the body. He passed the crowd and felt how each person carries within themselves a pain that they are afraid to admit, a desire that they cannot name, a longing that they try to drown out with actions. He did not pity them or rise above them. He simply saw. And in this vision there was kindness, not sympathy as an answer to the mind, but a warm, causeless feeling as if all this is one and the same breath, one and the same life playing out endless roles. He no longer needed to say the right words. He could be silent, and that was deeper than all conversations. Sometimes someone would start talking to him and then fall silent, not knowing why, not out of fear, but because in his silence, words became unnecessary. He listened as if he heard not only what was said, but also what was unsaid, and that was enough. And when someone once asked, "Are you happy?" he looked up at the sky and said, "No." And he added, "I am free from the need to be happy." He no longer sought happiness because he realized that what one seeks creates absence. He did not deny joy, did not drive away sadness. He allowed everything to be, and therefore he was free. And even death, which had previously lurked in the shadows of thought, became simply part of the movement. It no longer seemed like an end, because he had already died to everything false, dead to images, roles, fears. Only pure consciousness remained, in which even death was only a change of form, no more than the wind changing direction. He was here, always here, in every step, in every breath, in every look. He became nothing and therefore became everything, without a center, without boundaries, without the need to be seen, understood, acknowledged. He disappeared, and for the first time really appeared. Now his days flowed like a river, without a goal but with a direction. He no longer asked, why? Not because he had ceased to be interested, but because the question had dissolved into the fullness of being itself. What had once seemed important, success, opinion, recognition, now seemed like a dream from which he had awakened. Sometimes he returned to the places where he had suffered before, to the rooms where he had broken down, to the streets where he had wandered with his head down. But now, everything was different. The space had not changed, but the perception had. He felt the same pain that had once engulfed him, but now it was like wind passing through an open door. Nothing lingered anymore. It did not hold. One day he noticed that he had stopped waiting for change. He had stopped dreaming that someday everything would become better, because he realized that nothing should become different. Everything is already filled with peace, if you look not with the eyes of expectation, but with the eyes of presence. He saw old people hurrying to finish their work. He saw young people greedily grasping at impressions. He saw children not yet torn away from their nature, and he understood. Everything is fragments of one flow. No one makes mistakes. Everyone is simply walking, some slowly, some blindly, some screaming. But everyone is going home, to themselves, to the same silence that always waits behind thoughts. And in this understanding, the need for arguments, for proof, for being right disappeared. He no longer wanted to be the one who knows. He did not hold on to the truth. He lived by it. And it was not a word, not a thought, not an idea. She was the silence in which everything appears and everything disappears. One night he sat by the fire. Sparks flew up, disappearing into the darkness. And he felt every moment is also a spark. It appears, it goes out, and there is no need to catch it. Everything that comes already belongs to the eternal. He closed his eyes, not to leave, but to be even closer. And in this darkness, among the sounds of the world, he finally saw the light that never went out. Not the external, not the internal, but the one that was there before everything, who he always was, and always will be. No name, without form, just I am. He did not know how much time passed. The days began to resemble the breath of the universe. Inhale, exhale, pause. Everything became a single rhythm. He ate when he felt hungry. He slept when darkness came. He spoke, rarely, only when words were not born from the mind, but rose like water from the depths, purely and simply. Sometimes he returned to noisy places, to markets, on trains, among crowds. People looked at him and seemed to sense something strange, something inexplicable. They could not say who he was, but they felt a peace that did not suppress, but expanded. It was like the space between words, like a pause between notes, and there was something ancient in it, something familiar. He knew that no one can give silence to another. It cannot be imposed, taught, sold. It is not created by force. It opens up when you let go of everything that prevented you from hearing it, everything you imagined about yourself. He began to notice. Birds are always in the present. The wind never thinks about the future, and only man lives between yesterday and tomorrow, forgetting the taste of what is now. He smiled, seeing this, not with mockery, with tenderness, because he knew this is the way. Everything is the way. Even delusion leads to awakening, even pain to awareness. One day he saw a little child playing in puddles, laughing, falling, getting up again. His mother shouted, "Be careful, you'll get dirty." And he just waved his arms all in drops, in dirt, in life. And he understood, this child is closer to the truth than all the wise men arguing about meaning. Because silence is not a rejection of the world. It is a complete dissolution in it, not as an object, but as the background itself. He no longer felt the boundaries between himself and the tree, between himself and the passerby, between himself and the air. Everything was one. Everything was him. And when the voice did rise in his head, with anxiety, with old pain, with old words, he no longer resisted. He said to that voice, "I hear you. I understand where you're coming from. You are part of the journey, but I am not you." And then the voice would fade away, or continue, but like a distant ringing, nothing more. He became transparent to the world, and therefore whole. He could no longer be hurt, because there was nothing to hurt. He could not be deceived, because there was nothing to cling to. He simply looked. He simply lived. He simply was. And in this being, quiet, pure, endless, the last question finally disappeared. Not because the answer was found, because the one who asked disappeared. He felt all boundaries disappearing, between I and not I, between the inner and the outer. The world became like a river that you can't step into twice, but which always flows in the same direction, to infinity. He was no longer an observer. He became a stream, without thinking, without planning, without trying to hold on to a single thought. He let everything happen. The wind, the words, the feelings, the events. Each moment was born and died, like a star flaring up in the night sky. He did not cling to the light. He accepted the darkness, and in that darkness he saw wholeness. In the silence that had become his home, he heard not noise, but music. The music of life, eternity, and unpredictability. Music in which every movement has meaning, and at the same time has none. Where there is no beginning or end, only the endless present. And then he came to the realization, to be means not to fight, not to hide, not to search. To be means to allow everything to be, including oneself. To be means to dissolve, to become what has always been, emptiness, full of life. He smiled at the simplicity, without words, without effort, without purpose. He was a light that does not burn but illuminates everything around. He was the silence in which the whole world sounds. He was just, and this is simple, there was eternity. He felt the last chains disappearing, expectations, fears, desires. Everything that had once seemed important, like leaves, fell from the tree of his consciousness. And in this serene emptiness, a new fullness was born. Not emptiness, but a space in which everything could be. He stopped trying to change anything, stopped wanting to find answers. The answers themselves came when he stopped waiting for them. The world opened up to him, not as a riddle, but as a living breath, free, flowing, inexplicable. Sometimes it seemed to him that he was dissolving in this world, becoming wind, light, water. In these moments, he understood that there is no I separated from everything. There is only the flow of life, endless and mysterious. He was no longer looking for meaning because meaning was no longer a thing to be found. It had become a feeling, subtle and deep, like the touch of a shadow on a face at midday. And when the voice in his head rose again, demanding, arguing, tormenting, he met it with a quiet smile, not resisting, not running away, just letting the voice be, like part of a larger canvas. Deep down, he knew that this voice was not him, and the silence behind it was who he was. He walked on, not there, not here, just walked, not in search, but in acceptance. And in this acceptance, he found peace that does not depend on circumstances or thoughts. Because true peace is not a goal. It is a state in which all goals disappear. He was there, where there is no way, where there is no time, where there is no I, where there is only presence. Presence was his home and his freedom at the same time, without walls and without restrictions. In this state, he no longer felt the need to prove anything, to himself or to others. He did not need to be strong, wise, or right. He simply was. Every moment now was a new discovery, a fresh breath of life, unclouded by thoughts of past or future. He saw the stars twinkling not to get closer, but because they were already here, always had been here, always would be. Just like him, just part of an endless stream. Sometimes he would remember what he had been before, the fears, the struggles, the attempts to control and manage. But now they seemed like a dream, distant and quiet. He looked at them with gratitude for helping him get here, to the present. And when the voice inside rose up, still loud, insistent, he was no longer afraid. He knew that behind every word, behind every impulse, there was only an old story that he had already let go of. He smiled at this inner game, thanked the voice for its efforts, and allowed himself to return to silence. The silence was not emptiness, but depth, depth in which the whole world was reflected. In that depth there was no separation, there was no struggle, there was only is. And so he walked on, without a goal, without fear, without a past, and without a future. He walked simply because to walk is to live, and to live means to be the silence behind the voice. He walked without thinking about the direction, without striving for a place or a state. Each step was an expression of presence, not mechanical, but a conscious breathing of body and soul. The wind blew on his face, bringing freshness and freedom, and around him, an infinite number of sounds, colors, and sensations that had previously been lost in the bustle of thoughts. He realized that there was no way to himself, because he had always been here. He had just forgotten it in the noise and bustle. Now, having let go of the struggle and expectations, he was whole without the need to be anyone in particular. Sometimes the silence seemed so complete that it became audible, like a sound born from the depths of being. In these moments, he felt one with the world, in which everything from the smallest blade of grass to the distant stars was part of one great breath. He smiled at this realization, quiet, silent, and boundless. He knew that the noises of life and the voices in his head were just waves on the surface of the ocean of consciousness. They came and went, but the depths remained always calm. And in this peace there was no fear, no regret, no desire to change the past or control the future. There was only the present, pure, unadulterated, and free. He moved on, dissolving and at the same time remaining himself. He walked, because to be means to move in eternity. And in this movement he was eternal. He no longer sought meaning because meaning was no longer a problem to be solved. It had become a state, quiet, deep, and inexpressible in words. In this state, every moment was fullness, every breath a manifestation of life, and there was nothing that could separate him from the world around him. He watched the sun slowly sink below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. In this simple act, he saw infinity, which has no beginning and no end, only an eternal now. The voice inside would sometimes return, whispering doubts, raising old worries, but now it sounded so distant, like an echo of the past, unable to disturb the silence of his presence. He accepted these sounds without pushing them away or submerging them, letting them be like clouds floating across the sky. He knew that freedom was not in getting rid of the voice, but in ceasing to be it, in seeing yourself beyond thoughts, emotions, and images. He walked on, carrying with him this simple truth, that he is not a voice, not a thought, not a feeling, but the silence itself, in which everything is born and everything goes away. And in this silence he found peace, a peace that did not depend on anything because he was free from everything. He just was. He walked on, not thinking about the path or striving for any goal. Every movement he made was a manifestation of this silence, natural, free, filled with a deep presence. The wind gently touched his skin. The rustling of the leaves sounded like the whisper of life itself, and the world around him seemed alive, breathing, united. He understood that all the searching, all the efforts were just reflections of the voice that was screaming in his head. But now he was listening not to it, but to the silence behind it, the same one that was silent and boundless. And this silence was not emptiness, but an endless space that contained everything: joy and pain, light and darkness, life and death. He allowed everything to be. He did not judge, he did not resist, he was not afraid. In this acceptance, a freedom was born that does not require effort, does not depend on circumstances, and is not connected with expectations. He walked simply because it was natural, because being and walking are the same thing. And in every step, in every breath, in every moment, he felt this deep, living silence, the one that lies at the basis of everything that exists. He was not a voice, not thoughts, not feelings. He was the silence behind them. He walked through a world that seemed both familiar and new, as if he were seeing its true essence for the first time, hidden behind familiar images. Sounds, smells, colors, everything was filled with a special meaning that needed no words or explanations. Each moment was whole, complete, and yet open to endless continuation. Sometimes the voice inside tried to restore the old order, demanding action, judgment, control. But he no longer gave in to these impulses. Instead, he met them with gentle kindness, allowing the voice to sound without giving it power. He knew that the voice was only part of a flow, and that flow could not be stopped or contained. He stopped fighting with himself and the world. Instead, he became part of the movement, the eternal dance of life, in which there is no beginning and no end, but only an endless present. And in this presence, in this living silence, he felt at home. Not because he came somewhere, but because he realized that he is always here. He was not one to speak, think, or feel. He was the one who listened, to those who see, for those who simply exist. He walked without a goal or aspiration. His steps were light, as if he were moving on water without touching the ground. In every moment he found infinity, not in the distant future, not in the past, but in the present, in which everything merged into a single whole. The world seemed to cease to be divided into parts. Time, space, feelings, and thoughts dissolved into a single ocean of being. The voice that had once been the master of his inner world now sounded like a distant wind that did not disturb the peace. He no longer fought it, did not try to silence it or run away. He allowed the voice to be there. He watched it with quiet acceptance, knowing that it was just a wave on the surface of the ocean of consciousness. The wave comes, the wave goes, and the ocean remains. He felt his body and mind cease to be sources of discord and struggle. The body is like a temple where the spirit resides, and the mind is just an instrument, not a master. He stopped identifying himself with worries, fears, with the noise that was born in his head. He realized that all this was like shadows on the wall, and he was not the shadow, but the light that created them. The past and the future became illusions that lost their power in the face of the living moment. He didn't need history to be himself, didn't look for justifications or explanations. Everything that was a lesson. Everything that will be another breath of the universe, and now was all that really existed. He remembered how he had once lived in constant anxiety, afraid of losing control, afraid of not being good enough or too vulnerable. Now those fears seemed foreign to him, like they were someone else's dream. He didn't try to suppress them. He simply let them dissolve into a silence that was deeper than any thought. In this silence, he found a peace that was independent of circumstances, a peace that he could carry with him wherever he went, a peace that asked for nothing in return. He began to notice that in every person, in every being, there was this same silence, hidden under noise, fear, and pain. And in this understanding arose a feeling of deep compassion, but not pity. It was not pity, but the realization that everyone is part of a single whole, and that everyone is on their own path to the same silence. He saw people hurrying, trying to hold on to things that slipped away like water through fingers. He understood them, because he had once lived like that. But now he walked differently, freely and without fear, with an open heart and a clear mind. He allowed himself to feel everything, joy and sadness, pain and delight, without resistance. Because he knew everything comes and goes, and he remains. Not as a person, not as a set of thoughts and feelings, but as a space in which everything happens. There was no loneliness in this space because it was full of life. There was no need for confirmation or recognition. It was enough in itself. He walked through life as if through an endless field, where every movement was a dance and every breath was a song. He did not seek the way, he was the way. He did not seek meaning, he was meaning. He did not seek himself, because he was the one who observes, the one who listens, the one who simply is. And in this just is was contained all the freedom, all the joy, and all the infinity of being. He no longer looked for anything outside himself, because he realized that everything he needed was already here, inside, in the silence that had always been with him, but which he had not been able to hear before. Now it had become his home, his support, and his freedom. He walked through the world not as if he were running from himself, but as if he had come home. His steps were light, and his heart was open. He was not afraid of the wind or the rain or the darkness, because he knew that inside him was a light that would not go out, a light born of the silence behind the voice. And when the voice again rustled with doubts and fears, he only smiled and quietly reminded himself, "You are not the voice. You are the silence behind it. You are the presence that always was, is, and will be. You just are." In this simple truth he found eternity, not as time, but as a state of pure being. And with this knowledge he continued to walk, without a goal and without a path, just to be.